Shoot, I got a lawyer now. You pay me. All right, I'd like to introduce an athlete who would like to speak to you tonight about why we are here. He spent 11 years in the NFL on 2 champion teams. He also was a broadcaster and got 2 Emmy nominations. I've been on Best Damn. We got 5. That don't mean nothing. No, I'm joking. Ladies and gentlemen, Todd Christensen.
I have to say, before I begin the remarks that I've penned, I understand that LaDainian Tomlinson was too young to remember Jim Brown, but I was not. And in the backyard of Eugene, Oregon, with a football under my arm, I remember vividly the 6'2", 225-pounder with a 32-inch waist, the rush for 12,312 yards, averaged 5.2 yards per carry, and scored 106 touchdowns and averaged 104 yards per game. You meant a lot to me, and I want you to know that. And I want to apologize. I want to apologize to your lady friend for bothering you like that, but you meant a lot to me as a youth. As John Kissick got up, I was one of the few, I was commenting to Jim Hill, I was one of the few handful that was here originally when this began. And I remember what a tremendous thrill it was to get an opportunity to rub shoulders with some of the athletes. Mr. Kissick pointed out that there weren't too many, but there were enough to thrill a hardcore sports fan like myself. And I remember what a tremendous thrill it was to meet Kareem Jabbar, who you could argue was the greatest basketball player of all time with the numbers that he compiled as a 6-time MVP and as a 6-time NBA champion. I remember getting a chance to meet Willie Mays, who actually had to cuff my son because he was so persistent wanting to get an autograph. But of course now the Say Hey Kid has the moniker of the greatest living baseball player, as well as possibly the greatest all-around baseball player of all time. In addition, I remember getting a chance, Jim Hill is not going to remember this, but he introduced me to Sugar Ray Robinson. And with all due respect to Messrs. De La Hoya, Mayweather, Leonard, and others, that was the greatest fighter pound for pound of all time. And I remember what a thrill it was. Yeah. I remember how annoyed he was when I berated him with stories about LaMotta or Pep or Basilio or many of the other great fighters that he had, and his wife had to keep patting me on the shoulder to slow down, And of course, 6 months later, he passed away. But I remember thinking to myself, what heroic deeds that these people had come to fruition in their lives, and what respect I had for their athletic abilities. Well, this was some 20 years ago, and in November of that particular year, my vantage point changed considerably on what was heroic. Pardon me. My youngest son, Terran Joel Christensen, was born that particular year. He was born with spina bifida, and for those of you that are not privy to this, it's a neurological disease that affects the natural flow of spinal fluid from the brain. It also affects the lower extremities and your ability to have bowel movements. And in that period of time, in his 20 years of life, he has endured hundreds of hospital visits, thousands of hours of rehabilitation, and 25 major operations. And I would remark, if I may be scriptural for a minute, those of you that are familiar with the life of Job and that particular story, you remember that this was a great and famous and wealthy man who, despite his being perfect in his generation, as it pins in the scriptures, lost everything. And at the point of time when he was sore with boils, his wife came to him and said, "How dost thou now maintain thine integrity? Curse God and die." And his response was, "What? Shall we receive good at the hand of God and not suffering?" My son has endured an inordinate amount of suffering, and he personifies what the writer Thackeray pointed out when he said, "It is greater to endure than to dare." And if I can use the sports nomenclature this evening, the famous coach Vince Lombardi once said, It is not in never falling, but in rising again after you fall. My son has done that literally and figuratively. And now as a middle-aged man, I feel compelled to tell you how blessed I feel that I am. As a young man, my hero sat across from me at the dinner table with my father. And now as a middle-aged grandfather, my hero still sits across from me at the dinner table as my youngest son. I would be remiss if I did not mention, however, a crucial unsung hero, and that is his mother. While I proffer the requisite nurturing for a father, I do nothing to the level of what that mother does, Kathleen Simmons Christensen. I want her to know how much she has meant to Taryn, and for the rest of you mothers who nurture. Woodrow Wilson once said, "No man has attained spiritual manhood until he has learned that it is finer to serve someone else than it is to serve him. Has attained spiritual manhood until he has learned that it is finer to serve someone else than it is to serve himself." My wife and so many other women like that do that in terms of being mothers of special children like Taryn. And so as the prophet said in the last chapter of Proverbs, in chapter 31, who can find a virtuous woman? Well, Taryn, that is your mother. If I may, I've taken far too much time. Let me conclude with two other thoughts, if I might. An old football coach had something lying on his desk once that I read, and it has stuck with me for many, many decades. It said, "Sometimes your best isn't good enough. Sometimes you have to do what is required." I wish to applaud Dr. Lemoyne and his associates, and many people are laboring to overcome the diseases that are rampant within our society. Nevertheless, they continue to do what is required for us to have healthy children, and I'm grateful for that. And the second thought includes all of us. In the little tiny book before Revelation in the New Testament, the book of Jude, in that one and only chapter in verse 22, it says, "And some having compassion, making a difference." It is incumbent upon us to make that difference, whether it be monetarily, with our attitudes, or with our time. Because not everyone can do everything, but everyone can do something. Thank you, and Godspeed.